I'm going to hand to Ewan Wilmshurst now, who's a member of the STIR board and who will chair the panel discussion. But just as a bit of an introduction, Ewan's 30-year career spans diverse roles in strategic communications, corporate affairs, social impact, education and international development. He's previously held senior leadership positions with organisations like IBM, Pearson, Coca-Cola, and most recently the Lego Foundation. And he currently acts as a strategic advisor and board member to a whole host of organisations, including the Global Schools Forum, the IKEA Foundation and Street Child. And we're super happy that he's a member also of the STIR Education Board, and also very happy that he's agreed to chair this panel today. So Ewan, I'll hand over to you to introduce the panel and take that forward.
Thanks, Jenny, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, this isn't the favourite of all my roles is the STIR board, goes without saying, but delighted to be here today as well and to hear the incredible work that's happening and that's part of a much, I think, wider, much needed debate around where does the development and humanitarian sectors go generally, where do we go with education, what does localization mean? And importantly, therefore, the panel we're going to have is really within that debate. What is the role that Global North NGOs, INGOs should play? One could say, if any, but should they play in this context going forward? And I'm delighted to be joined by a fabulous panel who I'll hand over to in a second. I'll just introduce them quickly and then ask them to say something about themselves before we get into the discussion. So today we're joined by Brad Olson, who's a senior fellow at the Centre for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution, by Ngamso Mtadse, who's the head of foundational learning at Teach for All, Karina Gardner, the CEO at IDP Foundation, and Lorena Alvarez, head of new projects at Ensina, Brazil. So Brad, if I start with you, could you just say a couple of lines about yourself to introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Thanks, Ewan, and thanks, Jenny and John, and thanks, everyone. I'm so excited about this conversation. I especially love the way the tone has been set. I'm Brad Olson, and I lead the Millions Learning project at the Center for Universal Education at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And we work on scaling impact of education innovations, primarily in low and middle income countries. And we really think about a lot of the things that John was talking about and what it means to put them into practice, to work alongside teams that have promising innovations that they're working to scale throughout locations. Thanks.
Thanks, Brad. And Ngamso, if you'd like to say a few words.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's good to be here today. I'm Ngamso from South Africa, Cape Town, and I'm a teacher by training. Unfortunately, my pre-service training never prepared me for the realities of a typical South African classroom, but I've kind of spent the last 6 years trying to figure out any foundational literacy and numeracy programs for scale. Now I'm at Teach for All and supporting network partners in strengthening their foundational literacy and numeracy across our 62 network partners. Thanks.
Fabulous. Thank you. And Karina.
Hi, thanks, Ewan. Thanks. Good to see everyone here. I'm Karina Gardner, and IDP Foundation is a private family foundation, and we've been funding and supporting education through both access to financing and improving quality, but we specifically focus on communities that are out of the reach of government generally, either quite rural or urban slums or areas where generally there's just not enough government schools. And so we look at trying to improve the quality to the independent schools that get set up by the community as a response to that need. But I'm really excited about the topic today. I have a background working in, among other places, USAID, and have gone through a big localization push that almost over 20 years ago now, and I've seen this come around a few times throughout my career, and I think it's a really important topic, and it slightly changes in some ways it doesn't, and so I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Karina. And Lorena?
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here. I'm Lorena. I'm from Brazil, based in São Paulo, and I work as head of new projects in Ensina Brazil. Ensina is part of the Teach for All network and has been working with leadership development in education in Brazil for 7 years now. And now we're aiming to scale our impact through new programs. And this is where we've partnered with STIR. And I'm very excited to share more about this partnership in the panel today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And welcome all of you. Thanks so much for taking the time as well today for this discussion. So we've got probably about 30 minutes for this discussion, which means unfortunately on this occasion, we're not going to be able to take live questions from the rest of you. But I would really encourage you to put your thoughts, reflections, questions in the chat as we go along. And the STIR staff team will make sure they'll be picked up and addressed over the course of the next few days and weeks as well. So the format, I'm going to ask a question to each of our panelists and ask them to spend 4 or 5 minutes each answering that specific question. And then it's dependent on the time, look to follow up. So Brad, let's start with you. And my question to you is, well, what is the evidence on scaling for impact? And how would you interpret what was discussed earlier by John and Jenny in light of this wider evidence as well? So over to you, Brad.
Great. Thanks, Ewan. Right. Hard to talk about the deep and broad knowledge base in a couple of minutes, but I'll give it my best shot. As I mentioned before, I lead the Millions Learning team at the Center for Universal Education, and we've been learning alongside over 40 teams in over 40 countries over the last maybe 6 years as they seek to scale their own promising innovations throughout whole systems, primarily in low and middle income countries. So in large part, I draw off that experience. Additionally, we've conducted research on how governments go about the work of adopting, adapting, and supporting promising innovations at scale. And then I've also come to know the existing research and literature knowledge base pretty well. So drawing on all of those things, maybe I'll just say a few things up front and then offer a couple of recommendations that come out of the research. Firstly, as John mentioned, and as Larry Cooley often says, we think about scaling impact. We don't think about scaling the innovation itself. The innovation is the means to the end of the impact that we ideally expect will improve lives for families and for children and for systems. And so, although that's a subtle difference, I think it's an important one. It means that reach is not necessarily the goal. The size of the innovation isn't necessarily the goal. We talk about optimal scale. The goal is, how can the innovation be embedded in a system so that it becomes the new normal in that location, and so that its effects, its impact, can actually change lives and change systems. I think that's one thing to think about. The second thing is, frankly, I think that scaling impact is as much an art as it is a science. There is an awful lot of technical knowledge about it, and we could talk quite a bit about that. But I think if we want to go back to this soil metaphor and the seed metaphor, that soil isn't simply a bunch of technical practices. We're talking about human beings. We're talking about the complexity of governments and electoral politics and external shocks to a system, which are unpredictable. And so a lot of this requires the nuance of working with people in politics and being adaptive and adaptable enough to handle the unpredictable part. And so in that regard, and I hope that we talk about this a little bit more later, the softer system notions such as trust and curiosity and collaboration and listening and learning from others really become an important part of the knowledge base of scaling. There are a couple of principles to share. I think I'll just mention a few of them that come out of the research and that come out of our own work. One of them is the need to have champions to work on the scaling alongside of the scaling teams, and what it means to engage a champion. We've identified different kinds of champions. Not all champion type is the same, and not all needs to be engaged in the same way. And different ones will have different value at different points in what is actually a very long scaling process, oftentimes more than a decade in the public sector. And so engaging champions and engaging them early and continually maintaining trusting, respectful, reciprocal relationships with champions is very important. When thinking about engaging government, it really helps to think like a decision maker. Government decision makers have an awful lot of pressures. They're balancing electoral politics, the work they do with external donor communities. They're thinking about different constituencies and pluralistic democracies in many of their locations. They're thinking about the fact that they don't have enough data to make decisions perfectly. They don't have enough time. There's constant government turnover. And so thinking like a government helps those who are engaged in scaling to better understand what questions government need answered, what data to present and when to present that, and how to present that, how to think about making sure that the innovation that they're hoping to scale is aligned with existing policy priorities of the government, thinking about not only the central government level, but also mid-level and local level and offices and folks. The third thing that we've found is the power of engaging in really understanding that practitioners, the teachers and the school leaders, the users, if you will, of the innovation are engaged early as authentic partners in the process. This innovation or this scaling isn't done to them, it should be done with them. And what that means is a really complex part of the work, but it means that they have an awful lot to offer. I think, and this is really aligned with what John was saying earlier, and what I really appreciate about STIR is that these ideas are built on the premise that you trust, that people have the commitment and the excellence inside of them, and the external forces can unleash or can activate that. And I think that's incredibly important when scaling education innovations for impact, to draw on and to engage the practitioners as partners in the process. And then finally, I want to mention that there's an awful lot to learn from those who've already gone through this kind of work. While every situation is unique, there is real value to engaging in networks, to joining communities, learning the research, reading the briefs and the tools that others have done as they come before this. I think I'm probably about out of time, but I do want to mention the second part of your question. What does it mean for NGOs, especially in the global north, to engage in this work moving forward? And I expect, and I hope I'll have a chance to talk a little bit more about this, but essentially what I think there is real value to insider-outsider partnerships, if they're trusting and they're collaborative, because insiders have some real value, but also some blind spots. Outsiders have a wealth of experience across multiple contexts and expertise, but they have externally developed ideologies and agendas. The goal is that each side can bring out the best in the other. And if we want to go with that soil metaphor, maybe that's the fertilizer that makes the soil richer for the seeds to grow. Or if we want to switch metaphors, maybe it's the yeast that allows the bread to rise. Thank you.
Fabulous. Thanks so much, Brad. A lot to take away from there as well. I particularly loved that focus on, the human elements as well, and not being so focused just on the data and the numbers, but understanding that. I think obviously you sitting in Washington, D.C., the reference to systemic shocks to the system from electoral politics is probably feeling very real and raw right now as well. And then maybe the final takeaway from me, which I think is so important, the idea of none of us should be doing scaling to anyone. It's a joint effort, and it's really looking for that local, contextual, cultural, specific norms as well. So we'll come back, I'm sure, on a lot of that. But as we then build out this idea of scaling impact versus innovation, we all use the word impact, I think, widely and often very loosely without shared definitions. So, and Ngamso, I want to turn to you, because I know that Teach for All's evolved its own theory of change and how it thinks about impact. And I'd love you to tell us just a little bit more about that, how you see the similarities or differences to what STIR's doing, and anything that you picked up from what Brad's already had to say.
Sure. No, thanks for that. And probably to start off, to your first part of your question around Teach for All has evolved its theory of change, I probably would frame that as Teach for All has gotten better in understanding what it takes to cultivate leadership. And definitely we've gotten a lot better in leveraging this network of diverse partners, and how does that almost create this movement of shared vision. And particularly at a locally led base. So I wouldn't say we've changed, but it's more like we've gotten better in understanding some of these elements or components of our theory of change. And just quickly, basically what that looks like is, we believe in locally led and rooted organization, and that those that are closest to the work are the ones that are best positioned to drive the change, and those that have a better understanding of their context. So that's the one, and where each of these network partner organizations will then recruit and select young individuals with leadership potential to almost train and support over a 2-year fellowship. And once they're done with that 2-year fellowship, they kind of join an alumni trajectory. Almost we see that the critical part of changing education system is also having a diverse leadership landscape, and having these people drive these different innovations. So our alumni track is really focused in supporting and enabling and connecting alumni that have like-minded interest in solving for these particular complex education issues. And I mean, this covers a vast amount of things. I mean, I'm just in early grade or foundational learning. We've got some of my colleagues that focus on climate change, girls' ed, and so forth. So that's very quickly what Teach for All and its unifying principle is. So if I were to zoom in now with that kind of like recruit, select, a 2-year fellowship and join the alumni track with the length of the foundational learning, as someone who's kind of been involved in these interventions and almost what I call these technical solutions, at least from where I stand, the biggest missing piece, we've now figured, how to develop materials, how to design training, types of dosages of coaches and so and support and so forth. And I think we've made significant progress in the early grade sector. However, for me, I strongly feel like that people piece, and pretty much what John and Brad mentioned, that people piece, and like all of these things are just inputs in the system, and these inputs technically has to be driven and implemented by people. And often, as I said, like it's been quite a missing piece in all interventions that you see across the world around foundational learning. So at Teach for All, we're saying that we acknowledge that there is a whole vast of progress in early grades, and we're asking ourselves, as an organization that is primarily developing student leadership, teacher leadership, and therefore social entrepreneur leadership, how do we marry or integrate some of these evidence-based programs that we've seen across the world that have shown very promising results into our core model? And the way in which we've kind of thought about that is kind of categorized in 3 sort of goals or impact buckets. The first one is almost like the short-term goal. We recruit these fellows, they come from diverse graduate background, from your engineerings to your educations and so forth. So the biggest first almost like impact that we're trying to drive is like, how do we best prepare these folks in terms of both their content knowledge and as well as their pedagogical knowledge, and setting them up for success prior to their 2-year fellowship, almost like as the training piece or the pre-service training piece. The second bucket is almost like the medium-term impact that we'll also track and measure. That is almost like divided into 3. The first one is, are our teachers using and deploying some of these evidence-based approaches that are best fit for their context? That's the first one. And then the second piece is around like holistic education, both the classroom environment, are kids progressing in terms of non-academic outcomes as well as academic outcome. And I guess this is where the last piece comes in. And of course, the most important thing is, much as we want to see teachers teach better throughout their 2-year fellowship, and we want to see highly engaging learning environments, ultimately what we're trying to do through this initiative is improve literacy and numeracy outcomes. And of course, the long-term goal of this initiative, which links to very much the broader Teach for All mission, is we see ourselves as a critical piece of the puzzle in building that workforce and leadership workforce pipeline of FLN innovators and changes in the future. And we see ourselves as, and we understand that the 2-year fellowships and these leaders or these teachers having firsthand experiences in their own context, that they work deeply with the school system, the communities, and the families. These are the folks that we can identify and nurture and ideally be those in the future, in 10 years' time, in 5 years' time. These are the guys that will be leading these changes within their own context as an important piece. So in other words, the long term, we almost see ourselves as a workforce pipeline or talent pipeline of this type of work. So that's how Teach for All and the Foundational Literacy and Numeracy Initiative kind of looks at all of this, like this the people piece around developing that, both the expertise, equip them with the knowledge and the leadership competencies that is required to become change makers of the future. So very quickly on the similarities, I think John mentioned this quite earlier on. Again, it's the human piece. I think we often, and also Brad mentioned this, like a lot of the inputs are highly technical. And I've often been in many discussions where we talk about teachers and principals and all these people within the system, like these chess pieces that you can just move around, and forgetting that these are real humans. Yes, they operate within a broader system with multiple influences and uncertainties. But again, just touching on the fact, I suppose where the similarity is like we believe that interventions don't scale or sustain itself, right? It's the people that will scale and sustain the intervention. And therefore, for us, it's very important that these people in the developing the future workforce understand what collective leadership means, and driving, almost getting people onto the same vision and understanding why is this important and why is this critical, and being able to connect the dots with the idea that, you know, these will be the forerunners of these interventions. And very lastly, and I'm running out of time, the differences, I suppose, it would be mainly that, of course, Teach for All has taken quite a long-term approach into developing these leaders and social entrepreneurs. And whereas STIR, at least from how I understand it, works quite deeply with already existing teachers within the system and school leaders. So for us, we would like to see them go beyond just that school or classroom level, and that we kind of understand and have this vision of this movement that we need people across different systems, sectors, because education is something that impacts everyone, and therefore making sure that everyone is on this, have a shared vision of what that looks like is critical. So I would say the difference is where STIR zooms in almost education system level and working with teachers and principals predominantly, we almost encourage expansion beyond the schooling system, communities, families, and so forth. I'll hold it there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Fabulous. And again, a lot to take away from that. I think the theme that's emerging is the human or people theme. I think really important, the point you make about not just leadership, but the diversity of leadership. I think, you know, yesterday was World Children's Day. Lots of talk around actually how are children leading here? How are their voices centered in the decisions that make the most? And finally, that point you made around building a broader movement and recognizing there are multiple systems around a child, around a community, and that it's no point us operating in our individual silos, that we really need to break them and look at A, where are we different, and B, where can we complement, and where do we put the child at the center? So thanks for that. And that leads very neatly, I think, Karina, into the work at IDB Foundation, where you focus, I know, a lot on collaboration, on partnerships and localization. So maybe you could tell us a bit more about how you think collaboration, how you see the role of Northern NGOs, Global North NGOs, are changing in the context of the broader education debate and sector today. Over to you, Karina.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I think it's an interesting area to be reflecting on, especially the idea of collaboration in the framing of localization. I think, you know, having mentioned earlier, sort of seeing the shift of what the global NGO plays along the way. And I think, you know, there's been over time this idea that there's an interest in having a global NGO go from being the implementing partner to maybe being more of that intermediary, where they're able to then work with community-based groups and help build capacity and kind of be that sort of pass-through support system. I think that's kind of where we've landed now, although the ambition is bigger. I think the ambition for everybody is bigger than that. And ultimately, you know, where we'd love to see is a place where a local community and local organizations have a demand for the expertise and are calling upon global NGOs to support them, but they're the driver and they're in the driving seat. And I think that's still a ways away with the way our funding structures are set up. It's something as a small funder that we have the privilege to be able to do. But again, having worked within much larger, foreign aid structures, I know that there's a lot of red tape that still gets us stuck in that intermediary mode. And so while we're stuck in that intermediary mode, but while we all as global NGOs and as funders and actors do have this commitment to localization and know the importance of it, how do we do that differently and kind of move it in the right direction? And I think this is where the STIR focus on, really thinking about what's the added value. And I mean, that's another way of saying, that how are we the fertilizer? How are we the yeast? But I think understanding motivation is such an important part of it, that the example around spending lots and lots of times of building up local relationships, no question how invaluable those local relationships are. They're absolutely critical to getting anything done. But did you need to build them? I think that's the right question to be asking. When we're talking about overcrowding in this space, we've created systems where global NGOs are directly competing against each other, even though they all stand for the same thing, want the same outcome, are working in the same space. How do we overcome that? I think if you were going to take a corporate analogy and I was an investor, I would, when I'm investing in a product, immediately ask for a competitor landscape and to understand, okay, how is yours going to be the better bet? How is it going to stand apart? I only have one bet, winner's going to take all, or, you're going to have a bit of market share. What is it that's going to convince me to invest in you? And I think we have poorly kind of created that same model when we're looking at funding, and it goes with this lovely saying in a high level of, we won't need to scale impact, not interventions. But then what that has us doing is we're putting in proposals where we're claiming we're the organization with the bigger impact. Pay attention to us because you'll get more impact per dollar from me than you will from them. And we're completely losing sight of our opportunity to collaborate in those moments. And so I think, from a global NGO point of view, I think it's more along the lines of, asking questions around, first of all, where's the local demand for what we're asking? What is it that they want from us, and who's asking for it, as opposed to what's the funder asking? Who's the local community, the ministry, or the organization that has come and said, this is what we need from you? Two, when you're doing that competitive landscaping, thinking through who's already doing most of these activities. And how do I not, either just mimic or reinvent or adaptation, way overused word, adapt this particular intervention for my setting, but instead actually, how do I go improve the impact of that group over there that's already doing this activity, that's already got those relationships, that's already doing those things? How do I go in there? And so I think true collaboration is really, really hard. It's just full stop. It's hard. It's a lot easier to, we have lots of amazing African sayings, go fast, go alone, go far, go together. It works. It's a real reason. But that's why this focus on intrinsic motivation, whether, STIR's doing it in the classroom setting and with teachers and with leaders, but that intrinsic motivation is something to understand with all stakeholders when you're putting together any sort of a collaborative process and understanding what are the different perspectives that are bringing people in. And then taking that over to the localization conversation, I think there's also a question about what is true localization, because true localization is not just getting a Ghanaian when you have a program in Ghana on your board or in your leadership, or having sign off from government, because how connected are these particular Ghanaians to their communities? I mean, they are most likely among the top 1% of their country and have a really amazing education experience in life, and may or may not be connected to the work that you're actually trying to do. And so I think depending on what you're trying to influence and the systems you're trying to change, how often are you coming at that system from the bottom up? How often are you actually in touch with the local actors, the youth, the constituency, the parents, the community? The previous speaker just talked about going beyond the classroom and really thinking about that community, because I think my last thought that I would like to leave you with is that scaling is not a strategy, it's a choice. And the choice to scale actually comes from the community. It comes from when a local actor chooses to buy in to what you have actually presented to them. They want to participate. They believe in what has been brought to them and choose to do that even when you leave. Even it benefits them. They feel it. They see it. Scaling is a choice. And so the minute you give somebody a choice that they actually truly want, scale happens.
Fabulous. Thank you, Karina. Again, so much to I think pick out from there. I think really, interesting points around the demand-led piece. Very interesting points around how we understand the complexity of localization, and we don't just bandy it around and create a new kind of top-down northern-based tokenism either. I think where we tick boxes. The competitive piece, as someone who's worked a lot in the private sector, and I certainly wouldn't say that we should be applying many of the rules from there. But I think it is interesting that markets will define whether you succeed or not, and won't allow multiple organizations to do the same thing unless they can add some kind of value. And I think that's often the challenge in the INGO sector as well. And the last point you make around scale being a choice, I think is wonderful. Having worked in some big funders in my time, I've also seen when imposed scaling is done from a funder, we scale some of the worst ideas possible. And I think that's something to remember. Bad ideas are often more easy to scale than good ideas too. So much to take away from that. And so finally, let's move on to Lorena. And at Ensina Brazil, I know you've already worked with STIR under this new approach, and love to just hear a bit more about your experience of that, what's worked well, honestly, what maybe hasn't worked so well, and how would you like to see this work continuing in Brazil, and beyond?
Thank you for your question, Iwan. And first, I'd like to say I'm very connected to what Karina has been saying here, and it's a pleasure to be here together with Nangamso and also Joe Owen and see multiple organizations from throughout the world working and collaborating together, because in the end, we have the same objective here, which is foster excellent quality education for all children. So it's a pleasure to be here. And I've had the pleasure to work with STIR under this new approach throughout this year, and we've learned and applied a lot from STIR's model. The benchmarking that was facilitated mainly through shared materials and also mentoring sessions with Niha, who is here, has given us mainly the agility to develop a new program that Ensina Brazil has already been envisioning for the past couple of years. So as I already mentioned before, Ensina Brazil is part of the Teach for All network, and we have been working in Brazil for 7 years now, mainly with incoming teachers. So we develop leadership starting from the classrooms, and the teachers that we select and we train, they work in public schools for until 2 years, as also Nangamso has already said here. And what we've heard in the past 7 years from governments that work together with us is, how can we bring this Ensina way to more teachers in our networks, and not only the incoming teachers that work in temporary contracts within the governments. And this Ensina way, we asked one of the secretaries that worked together with us, and she said that the way she would describe the Ensina way is that our teachers, they bring hope, that they have something special that they don't often see in other teachers. So I also say this may be intrinsic motivation. I don't know. And what we have been asking ourselves at Ensina is, how can we shift teachers' mindset at scale to create and sustain a new education culture in Brazil? So we've been doing this with 200 teachers per year in our Ensina program. And now that the governments are asking us to spread this through more teachers, how can we do this at scale and sustainable in a sustainable way? So this is where we saw a lot of synergy with STIR's work. We are very aligned in vision, and we understood that we could learn a lot from your model. So throughout the collaboration that we did this year, the main 2 points I'd like to share that we've learned is, first, the importance of co-designing with governments, which was critical for those partners' engagement. We start our program this year with a diagnosis with the governments, and after with co-designing workshops together with them to understand what were their core needs and how could we support them in what they need the most within their networks. And second, we gained from STIR a clear, actionable model to kick off our pilot. So the pilot program that we developed this year was inspired by STIR's 3-month learning improvement cycles and also by the peer communities that STIR nurtures within the countries that they work. So from April to now, we started this program in April. And from April to now, we piloted this leadership development program with 250 school leaders in 3 different state governments here in Brazil. And we reached an 82 NPS with this program. And much of this success is thanks to the partnership with STIR. So I truly believe we were able to develop a program so fast because we learned from Ensina's DNA and from the 7 years experience that we already have, but also from STIR's impact and experience with reaching millions of students. And where I'd like to see this partnership evolve is in deeper and more practical understanding on how we can foster intrinsic motivation. So autonomy, mastery, purpose. It would be great to receive more specific knowledge on how we can use this evidence-based approach in our curriculum. This year, we've worked with STIR in mentoring sessions. It was more or less one mentoring session every 2 months. So we believe that a more hands-on approach would be great for us to implement the AMP principles within our curriculum. And lastly, at Ensina, we know how to find, develop, and connect incoming teachers with intrinsic motivation, but we know we can learn a lot from STIR's evidence-based approach on how to help not only the incoming teachers, but all teachers, school leaders who have already been working in governments for many years to keep that inner fire burning and making this light spread and enlighten whole schools and change schools' cultures throughout Brazil.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. And just hearing some of that already, I think is very motivating. The idea of the teachers bringing hope. I think hope's something we all need a lot more of at the moment as well, and shouldn't undervalue it in whatever line of work, but particularly in teaching as well. So I think that's incredibly important. And just the other pieces that you brought out there around what you know, and then what complementary knowledge maybe from other places or for a global organization can bring to that, and that complementarity I think is really, really important. So thanks so much. I'm very conscious we have about maybe 4 minutes left maximum, and I don't want to stem this debate and this discussion off too soon. So what I want to do is maybe just hand back to each of you. Now you've all heard what each other has to say, and give you 1 minute each just to go through and react, add any advice you might like to all of us, but to STIR particularly as well, and then we'll wrap up. But please, just 1 minute each. So we'll start back at the top, and then as soon as one of you's finished, the other can just jump in.
Great. I think that's me. These have been such interesting sets of remarks. I've been taking notes madly, and I want to thank you all for the insights. I would say, gosh, just very quickly, I've had 2 presentations in 2 days on a similar topic, and the audiences are very different. And what I'm struck by is the discourse in each of these 2 has been completely different. And the other one was very technical minded, very policy dominated. It was a particular language, it was a particular way of viewing scaling impact. What I really love here, and what I hope that STIR will hang on to and leverage as their secret sauce, if you will, or their comparative advantage, is this focus on the human side of things, this focus on the soft system parts. I think that that's really needed in this space, and I feel like it's something that really can make a difference. And the ability to leverage that in multiple ways, like we've talked about today, I think is incredibly important. I would say maybe 2 pieces of advice, and I want to end with a line from a poem. One of them is, don't forget about power. I think when we talk about all of this, we sometimes are a little overly optimistic, but the truth of the matter is that groups and systems and individuals have power and they don't like to give it up. And if systems are going to change, power needs to be reallocated. And so maybe rather than move around that, it might be good to take that head on. And then secondly, I think there's a real need to not get discouraged when we focus on the human dimensions of this work, because it is so complex to work with humans. I'm left with one of my favorite poems is by Richard Wilbur. And so if you ask me, what do I wish for Stir, I would look at the last stanza of his poem, The Writer, where he says, "It is always a matter, my darling, of life or death. I wish what I wished you before, but harder."
Thanks for that ending, Brad, over there. And I think you took probably like two of my comments around the advice. But I think just to reiterate, I think Stir here is sitting with something, at least in the foundational learning space. They've got the special and unique expertise around understanding motivation, which many NGO civil societies and F1N tend to focus just on the technical end. When I first met John in person, I said to him, why did I not meet you in the beginning of the Funda Wande journey? I think there were many, and partner of this, there's definitely many things we could have learned and leveraged from Stir's expertise. And I suppose last three things, because Brad has mentioned some of these, seeing that I've got this platform, call to all organizations to be less Beyonces and really think about this, to say like there's no one silver bullet to this. This elephant is large and we need strategic partnerships to order to move ourselves forward. Secondly, to the funders, to a call to funders to stop creating Hunger Games. And I suppose the last question or something for reflection to Stir as they think around their modalities of how they work with local organizations is to not forget the part of developing the local talent or transferring some of these expertise for the local talent as a means to also sustain some of these gains.
Yeah, I'll come in and chime in on really appreciating all of the discourse. It's just, and it's not surprising because of the whole setup of Stir with this intrinsic motivation. It actually does lead to a completely different conversation, which is really, really welcome. But I would actually say that Stir is not unique in understanding intrinsic motivation. And actually, again, that is, embedded in the question and the setup of this entire dialogue around localization is actually local actors are those who are best to guide in what is intrinsic motivation, what is culturally driving things, what are the things you may or may not understand. And so I guess what I would say is, kudos to Stir for being the one to be so clear and brave around putting that front and center and in terms of exactly how we can work. And I think that I would call on a lot of others to say that, only more of that is going to benefit us. And there's not only one organization that can do that perfectly. I think that that's where the heart of collaboration comes. So thank you.
My turn. So as Ensina Brazil is moving from working only with incoming teachers to working with the teachers that are already in the system, so for 5, 7, 10, 20 years maybe, I really believe that intrinsic motivation is the secret sauce to help leverage those networks of teachers and also school leaders. So Ensina has been working with, we're saying our strategy is with the Ensina Brazil program, the 2-year program. First, the teachers work with the chalk in their hands for 2 years, and then we expect them to get with a pen in their hands and make decisions that will impact thousands of students. So we understand that Teach for All supports us with this strategy of getting more people with the right mindsets, with the pen in their hands. And we're seeing Stir support us in the other pillar, the pillar of the chalk in their hands. So how can we foster intrinsic motivation to leverage teachers that have been working for years and will continue working for years with students in Brazilian classrooms?
Fantastic. Thank you all so much. I'm not even going to attempt to summarize that discussion. So much richness. I've certainly learned a huge amount, and I think it is a different discourse and one that needs to continue. So a huge thank you from me and from STIR as a whole for all of you taking the time to join the panel today. And I'm sure we'll all continue this discourse more widely.